The Desert Trap. Captain Sarah Martinez had been tracking enemy movements for 3 days when the radio crackled to life in her hidden observation post. The message was brief but chilling. "Overlook, this is command. We have 220 SEALs surrounded in grid Echo 7. Repeat, 220 of our boys are trapped." Sarah pressed her eye to the scope of her Barrett M82 sniper rifle, scanning the rocky terrain below. What she saw made her blood run cold. The elite Navy SEAL teams, who had been conducting a classified rescue operation in the remote mountains of Afghanistan, were completely encircled by enemy forces. The SEALs had walked straight into a carefully planned ambush. The mission had started as a routine extraction. Intelligence reports indicated that 3 American contractors were being held in a compound deep in Taliban-controlled territory. The SEALs had been inserted under cover of darkness, expecting light resistance. Instead, they found themselves facing a coordinated attack involving over 400 enemy fighters who had been waiting for them. From her position on the ridge, Sarah could see the full scope of the disaster unfolding below. The SEALs had taken cover behind a series of concrete barriers and abandoned vehicles, but they were completely outnumbered and outgunned. Enemy fighters had positioned themselves on 3 sides of the valley, with heavy machine guns and rocket-propelled grenades raining down on the trapped Americans. The SEAL's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel James Hawk Morrison, was coordinating the defense from behind a burned-out truck. His radio communications were desperate but professional. Air support was still 20 minutes out, and ammunition was running dangerously low. Several of his men were already wounded, and the enemy was closing in from all sides. Sarah had been deployed as part of an Overwatch team, positioned on the high ground to provide intelligence and long-range support if needed. She was one of only a handful of female snipers in the military, having earned her position through exceptional marksmanship and nerves of steel. Her spotter, Sergeant Mike Chen, was scanning the battlefield through binoculars, calling out targets and distances. "I count at least 50 fighters on the North Ridge," Chen reported, his voice tense. "They're setting up a heavy machine gun position. If they get that thing operational, our guys are sitting ducks." Sarah adjusted her scope, focusing on the enemy position. The machine gun crew was working frantically to set up their weapon on a rocky outcropping about 800 meters away. Once operational, it would have a clear line of fire down into the valley where the SEALs were trapped. She could see the team leader directing his men, pointing toward the American positions below. The enemy had chosen their ambush site well. The valley was shaped like a bowl, with steep sides that made escape nearly impossible. The only way out was through a narrow pass that was now heavily defended by enemy fighters. The SEALs were trapped in what military tacticians call a kill box, a designated area where everything inside is considered a target. As Sarah watched through her scope, she could see individual SEALs moving between cover positions, trying to establish better defensive lines. She recognized some of the faces through her optics, men she had trained with, worked with, and considered friends. The thought of losing 220 elite warriors in a single engagement was unthinkable. The enemy fighters were not amateur insurgents. Their movements were coordinated and professional, suggesting they had military training. Some carried modern weapons and equipment, indicating they were well supplied and prepared for this operation. Intelligence later revealed that several foreign military advisors were directing the attack, turning what should have been a simple ambush into a sophisticated military operation. Sarah's radio crackled again. "Overlook, we need immediate support on the North Ridge. Enemy machine gun position is about to go live. Can you engage?" The distance was extreme, even for a skilled sniper. At 800 meters, with wind conditions and elevation changes, the shot would be at the very limit of her rifle's effective range. Moreover, the enemy position was partially concealed behind rocks, leaving only small windows of opportunity when targets became visible. Chen was already calculating wind speed and direction, using a handheld device to measure atmospheric conditions. "Wind is gusting from the southwest at 8 to 12 miles per hour," he reported. "Temperature is 85 degrees. Humidity is low. You'll need to compensate for the elevation difference and the heat." Sarah made minute adjustments to her scope, factoring in all the variables that could affect her shot. She had trained for situations like this, but the pressure was enormous. Missing meant that 220 American servicemen could die in the next few minutes. The weight of their lives rested on her ability to make an impossible shot under impossible conditions. Through her scope, she watched as the enemy machine gun crew finished setting up their weapon. The team leader was giving final instructions to his gunner, pointing down toward the trapped SEALs. In a few seconds, they would begin firing, and the American position would become untenable. The valley below had become a cauldron of violence. Explosions sent clouds of dust and debris into the air, while the constant chatter of automatic weapons fire created a deadly symphony. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from dozens of enemy positions, all focused on the small area where the SEALs had taken cover. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's voice came over the radio again, strain evident in his tone. "Overlook! We're taking heavy casualties. That machine gun position needs to be neutralized now, or we're going to lose this position entirely." Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself for what would be the most important shot of her career. The fate of 220 elite warriors hung in the balance, and she was their only hope. As she placed her finger on the trigger, she knew that the next few seconds would determine whether her fellow servicemen lived to see another day or became casualties of war in a remote valley thousands of miles from home. The critical moment. Sarah's finger rested lightly on the trigger as she controlled her breathing, slowing her heart rate to minimize any movement that might affect her aim. Through her scope, she could see the enemy machine gunner settling into position behind his weapon, preparing to unleash devastation on the trapped SEALs below. The distance was 847 meters according to her rangefinder, well beyond the typical engagement range for most snipers. The .50 caliber round from her Barrett M82 would take nearly a full second to reach the target, during which time wind, gravity, and atmospheric conditions would all work against the bullet's path. Sarah had made shots at this distance before, but never with so many lives hanging in the balance. Sergeant Chen continued feeding her environmental data through his headset. "Target is slightly elevated, approximately 15 degrees above your position. Crosswind is steady now at 10 miles per hour from your left. Barometric pressure is dropping. There's a weather front moving in." Sarah made microscopic adjustments to her scope, compensating for each variable. The enemy machine gunner was now loading ammunition into his weapon, his assistant gunner feeding the belt while scanning for targets below. Through her optics, Sarah could see the concentration on their faces as they prepared to open fire on her fellow Americans. In the valley below, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Several SEALs had been wounded in the initial assault, and their defensive perimeter was shrinking under constant pressure. Rocket-propelled grenades exploded against their cover positions, sending fragments of concrete and metal flying through the air. The sound of incoming rounds was constant, a deadly hail that forced the Americans to keep their heads down and limited their ability to return effective fire. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison was moving between positions, coordinating his men's defense while calling for ammunition and medical supplies over the radio. One of his team leaders, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, had taken shrapnel in his shoulder but continued directing his squad's fire at enemy positions on the eastern ridge. The SEALs' training and discipline were evident as they maintained organized resistance despite being vastly outnumbered. "Overlook! This is Morrison," came the urgent radio call. "We've got wounded who need immediate evacuation, but we can't move them with that machine gun covering the only exit route. If you can't neutralize that position in the next 60 seconds, we're going to have to attempt a breakout under fire." Sarah understood the implications. A breakout attempt would mean exposing the wounded SEALs to enemy fire as they tried to reach the evacuation zone. With over 400 enemy fighters positioned around the valley, Such an attempt would likely result in massive casualties. The machine gun position on the north ridge commanded a perfect view of any escape route. The enemy fighters seemed to understand this as well. Through her scope, Sarah could see additional enemy forces moving to reinforce their positions, cutting off any possibility of the SEALs fighting their way out. The ambush had been carefully planned, and every escape route had been anticipated and covered. Chen spotted movement on the eastern ridge. "I've got enemy reinforcements moving up the east side," he reported. "Looks like they're positioning mortars. If they get those tubes set up, they'll be able to drop rounds directly into our guys' position." The tactical situation was becoming impossible. The SEALs were not only outnumbered, but were about to be outgunned by heavy weapons that could strike them regardless of their cover. Time was running out, and Sarah's shot might be the only thing that could change the momentum of the battle. She placed the crosshairs of her scope on the enemy machine gunner's center mass. The man was young, probably in his 20s, completely focused on the task of setting up his weapon. Sarah pushed away any thoughts about the human being in her sights, focusing instead on the tactical necessity of the shot. This was war, and the lives of 220 American servicemen depended on her ability to do her job. The wind shifted slightly, and Sarah adjusted her aim accordingly. The bullet would need to travel in a slight arc to account for gravity and wind drift. At this distance, even a small miscalculation could result in a miss that would doom the trapped SEALs below. She had one chance to get this right. Through her scope, she watched as the enemy machine gunner finished loading his weapon and began to swing it toward the American positions. In seconds, he would begin firing, and the concentrated firepower would make the SEALs' position untenable. Sarah's window of opportunity was measured in heartbeats. The radio crackled with updates from the valley below. "Taking heavy fire from the west ridge," reported one team leader. "Need immediate support, or we're going to lose this position." "Medical supplies are running low," came another report. "We've got multiple wounded who need immediate attention." Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's voice cut through the chatter. "All stations, prepare for emergency breakout. We can't hold this position much longer." Sarah knew that a breakout attempt would be suicide with that machine gun operational. The enemy position commanded the entire evacuation route, and the concentrated fire would cut down the SEALs as they tried to move their wounded to safety. Everything depended on her ability to make an impossible shot under impossible conditions. She steadied her breathing one final time, her finger applying gentle pressure to the trigger. The enemy machine gunner was now sighting down his weapon, preparing to open fire on the trapped Americans below. Sarah's crosshairs were perfectly aligned with her target, accounting for distance, wind, and elevation. The moment stretched out like an eternity as Sarah made her final calculations. The lives of 220 elite warriors rested on the precision of a single bullet fired from nearly half a mile away. The pressure was enormous, but her training had prepared her for exactly this type of situation. She was the last line of defense between her fellow servicemen and disaster. In the valley below, the first enemy mortars began to fall among the SEAL positions, sending geysers of dirt and debris into the air. The tactical situation was deteriorating by the second, and Sarah's shot represented the only hope of changing the momentum of the battle. As her finger tightened on the trigger, she silently promised the trapped warriors below that she would not fail them. Victory against all odds. The Barrett M82 roared, its massive .50 caliber round cutting through the mountain air at over 2,800 feet per second. Sarah held her breath as she watched the bullet's path through her scope, knowing that nearly a full second would pass before she knew whether her shot had found its mark. Time seemed frozen as the projectile arced across the valley, fighting against wind and gravity. In the enemy position, the machine gunner was making final adjustments to his weapon, completely unaware that death was racing toward him at supersonic speed. His finger was moving toward the trigger, ready to unleash devastation on the trapped SEALs below. The bullet struck with devastating precision, hitting the enemy gunner center mass and dropping him instantly. The impact sent his body backward, knocking over the ammunition feeder and disrupting the entire machine gun crew. Sarah immediately worked the bolt of her rifle, chambering a fresh round as she shifted her aim to the assistant gunner who was scrambling to take over the weapon. "Direct hit!" Chen shouted through his headset. "Target is down! You got him!" But Sarah was already focused on her next target. The assistant gunner was reaching for the machine gun, trying to bring it back into action. At 847 meters, Sarah's second shot was even more challenging, as the man was moving and partially concealed behind the weapon itself. She led her target slightly, accounting for his movement, and squeezed the trigger. The second round found its mark, eliminating the assistant gunner and effectively neutralizing the machine gun position. The remaining crew members scattered, abandoning their weapon and seeking cover among the rocks. The immediate threat to the evacuation route had been eliminated, but the battle was far from over. In the valley below, Lieutenant Colonel Morrison immediately seized the opportunity. "All teams, the machine gun is down. Begin movement to Extraction Point Alpha. Wounded personnel have priority. Move, move, move." The SEALs began their tactical withdrawal, carrying their wounded comrades while maintaining suppressive fire against enemy positions. The elimination of the machine gun had created a window of opportunity, but it would not last long. Enemy forces were already moving to re-establish control over the evacuation route. Sarah continued providing overwatch, picking off enemy fighters who tried to pursue the retreating SEALs. Her rifle spoke repeatedly, each shot carefully placed to maximum effect. At 600 meters, she eliminated an enemy squad leader who was coordinating pursuit. At 750 meters, she took out a sniper who had the SEALs in his sights. Each shot bought precious time for her fellow servicemen to reach safety. Chen was calling out targets and providing continuous updates on enemy movements. "Multiple fighters moving down the eastern slope," he reported. "They're trying to cut off the extraction route about 300 meters ahead of our guys." Sarah shifted her position slightly, getting a better angle on the eastern ridge. Through her scope, she could see enemy fighters bounding from cover to cover, trying to reach a position where they could ambush the withdrawing SEALs. She began engaging them at long range, her accurate fire forcing them to seek cover rather than pursue their attack. The extraction was proceeding better than anyone had dared hope. The SEALs moved in practiced formation, with the most experienced warriors providing rear-guard action while others carried the wounded. Their training and discipline were evident as they maintained organization despite being under constant fire from multiple directions. Air support finally arrived in the form of 2 A-10 Thunderbolt aircraft, their distinctive engines announcing their presence across the valley. The ground attack aircraft immediately began engaging enemy positions with their powerful GAU-8 cannons, sending enemy fighters scrambling for cover. The psychological impact was enormous. The distinctive sound of the A-10's gun was known and feared throughout the region. "Overlook, this is Hawkeye Flight," came the pilot's voice over the radio. "We have eyes on friendlies moving to extraction, engaging enemy positions on the ridgelines. Keep your heads down." The A-10s made repeated passes, their 30mm rounds pulverizing enemy fighting positions and equipment. Secondary explosions indicated that ammunition and fuel supplies were being destroyed, further degrading the enemy's ability to continue the fight. The tide of battle had finally turned in favor of the Americans. Sarah continued providing precision fire support, working in coordination with the aircraft to eliminate remaining threats. Her elevated position gave her a perfect view of the battlefield, allowing her to spot enemy forces that might threaten the evacuation. Each shot was carefully calculated, designed to maximum tactical advantage while conserving ammunition. The first group of SEALs reached the extraction zone, a relatively flat area where helicopters could safely land. Medical personnel immediately began treating the wounded while security teams established a defensive perimeter. The evacuation was proceeding smoothly, but there were still over 100 SEALs moving through dangerous territory. Enemy forces made several attempts to disrupt the extraction, but each was met with devastating fire from Sarah's position and the circling A-10s. Her rifle continued to speak at crucial moments, eliminating threats before they could develop into serious problems. The enemy's initial advantage had been completely reversed. Chen was monitoring radio traffic from the extraction zone. "First helicopter is inbound," he reported. "Medical evacuation for the most seriously wounded is beginning. Looks like we're going to get everyone out." As the evacuation continued, Sarah reflected on the events of the day. Her 2 shots had eliminated the key threat that was preventing the SEALs' escape, but it was their training, courage, and teamwork that had made the rescue possible. The battle demonstrated the importance of every member of the military team, from the elite SEALs in the valley to the support personnel who made their mission possible. The last group of SEALs reached the extraction zone as the sun began to set over the mountains. All 220 warriors were accounted for, with the wounded receiving immediate medical attention. What had begun as a potential disaster had ended as a successful rescue operation, thanks to precise coordination between ground forces, air support, and long-range precision fire. As Sarah packed up her equipment, she received a radio message from Lieutenant Colonel Morrison. "Overlook, this is Morrison. On behalf of every man in this unit, thank you. Your shots saved our lives today. We will not forget what you did for us." The mission had demonstrated that in modern warfare, victory often depends on individual skill and courage applied at the critical moment. Sarah's willingness to attempt an impossible shot under impossible conditions had turned the tide of battle and brought 220 American servicemen home safely. Her actions that day would become legendary among Special Operations Forces, proving that when lives are on the line, there are no impossible shots, only the will to take them.